Notacon.
I think originally Froggy had invited Linus Torvalds to come here to speak to you about Linux and open source software, but unfortunately Mr. Torvalds is a little bit busy and was unable to make it here. But since any good convention requires at least one Finn to participate, you got the next best thing, which is me. My name is Niklas Lindroos. Online I'm known as Gore. Please excuse my not perfect English. It's not my native language.
Not mine either. My name is Chris Ragusa, also known as Bamba. English is my native language. No apology necessary. Now, I'm just curious. I know all of you guys. Have you guys ever mudded? Do you know what the muds are? Okay. You have? Okay. And you have? All right. All right. Do you want to go right into the introduction?
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Since there seems to be non-believers present here today, I'm going to give a brief introduction about what a MUD is. MUD, or MUDs, it's an acronym for multi-user dungeon, and in some cases, multi-user dimensions. They're text-based adventure games in which multiple users can interact and solve quests and adventure around over the internet. Now, MUDs are the precursors of the massive multi-user online RPGs that we see nowadays, for example, EverQuest and Ultima Online and World of Warcraft. For example, the initial planning of Ultima Online started in, was it 1991, by a bunch of MUD administrators. And today we have these really enormous games. One of the key points about the MUD, how it differs from normal computer games, is that it hasn't one specific goal to reach. It's a very cyclic world. It has no beginning, no end. You can keep on developing your character pretty much indefinitely. There is no score and no notion of winning or gaining success on the game. Want to add something?
Yep, I'll go right to mine.
Go ahead.
I will give you a brief overview of MUDs. What some of you may not realize is most MUDs are older than time itself. There are cave drawings in the south of France that show people using pole arms and ranged weapons against monsters, but unfortunately 30,000 years of lag hit us before we could get it productive again. There were some games that came up in the 60s and early 70s on the computers. The 1962 Space War was developed on the PDP-1. ARPANET came along in 1969, and I cannot recall the name of the fellow who invented this game. There was a text adventure called Adventure, and that was very popular in around 1972, and that was also on a PDP. The first game that most people agree started the MUDs harkens back to Essex University in 1979. It began as a student project. One of the graduate students was messing around with some code, and he got some buddies involved, and they wrote the first MUD. It was a collaborative effort. It was an effort that was subject to constant revision as hardware was improved, and even techniques as far as managing resources, particularly shared memory modules that would bog down the system and cause the rest of the university staff to complain, why are all these kids dragging us down? So after that, the next wrinkle they had was what we would call public access. They had a small educational network that the university was gracious enough to allow external users to dial in the wee hours of the day. And that meant other people in Britain could dial in and play this game in the morning. And it may not seem novel to you now because everybody seems to be wired 24/7, but back then they were truly creatures of the night. The next thing that happened was when they had hooked up to the ARPANET itself and then started distributing code. They had sent some up to Norway, to Sweden, to Australia, and to America. And with the open source code, people started tinkering it, making enhancements, sharing the ideas with others, like our good Linux. And that had fostered a growth in a whole bunch of different types. There were MUDs, there were mushes, there were moos, mucks, and as different people had different abilities and different intentions, I recall playing a very early MUD up in Iceland, and I went there just because when I was in the service I had spent 2 years there, so I wanted to go back, and I was talking to people and it was like, hey, do you remember this place? And we were doing this. But the MUD was boring because this was just a social experiment. All they wanted to do was build things to communicate with each other. So they built nifty seashells or animals that could transfer messages. They had no interest in the questing and the killing and the killing of other players that drives most of our mudding experiences. And then came Batmud. And let's see, well, we have these other things, but that's not for me.
Right. Now, one thing you need to realize that we Finns are not very fond of Swedes. Kind of like there is some small animosity between Americans and Canadians. It's the same thing between Finns and Swedes. And we Finns don't generally appreciate anything that Swedes have done. But there's one big exception. There was this one Swedish fellow called Lars Bensjö who invented the LP MUD scheme. And LP MUDs were unique in the sense that it allowed people to actually build on the world, build on the game itself, without any kind of downtime. So whereas in traditional programming, you have a program, you compile it, you abort the execution of the program and restart it again in order to get these fixes in the LP MUD, everything was like interpreted, and it was a possibility to develop it on the run all the time by a whole range of different people. So what Lars Bensjö did in 1989 was that he released the first version of the LP MUD driver, and he opened up a MUD called Genesis in Sweden. And as mentioned, the LP MUDs include a special coding language called LPC for Lars Bensjö C. It looks very much like a hybrid between C and C++, which allowed the developer to seamlessly expand on the actual game. Now, there was a bunch of MUDs that followed that based on the same code base, but I believe the only one that is still operating still today, and the one that we represent, is Batmud. And it opened its doors to the general public on April 14th, 1990. So in roughly, 5 days, we're having our 15th anniversary in Helsinki. In 1991, a MUD called Discworld got started. It's based on the world of Terry Pratchett, for those who are familiar with his somewhat crazy books. And in 1992, Genocide got started, which was one of the first, if not the first, multi-user game in a text environment which actually focused solely on killing other players.
And just to recap, Batmud is built around a medieval fantasy theme in which magic is common, orcs, elves, and various other creatures roam the streets. It's loaded with quests, scenic areas, diabolical monsters, and unfathomable treasures. Very unfathomable. What we're excited about was our friend Tackle had obtained a very powerful item created by the most powerful wizard on the MUD. And he paid an ungodly sum for it in game resources and has been spending several months uncovering its secrets. That was one of the charms of this, that he didn't know what the object was powerful. I mean, what it was. Yeah. But it's powerful, and it's like a little Pandora's box that won't hurt him. But it's been an item of considerable excitement. He's received a whole lot of communication from folks he's never heard of, just trying to find out, what does this do? What's it been like? How did it go? So that's our best unfathomable treasure. Our world is constantly being developed, and the players can build majestic cities and engage in trade. This is one of the things that makes Batmud unique in my experience, and I played about 15 MUDs, is that you were stuck with what was developed for you. You could pick up objects, you could manipulate them. In some places you could save them over reboots, but in our world we have craftsmen and merchants who are able to gather resources, amalgamate them, and create something else of their own, and then manipulate them, process, sell them. We interact in scenarios where they take on the aspects of characters from fantasy worlds: wizards, warriors, druids, barbarians, healers, assassins, and which acquire and lose magical powers, and we progress through fantastic adventures involving travel through a wild and wonderful world. We don't always do that in a harmonious way, as Gore said.
You guys don't actually make it easy on us sometimes.
Well, it's like having a large family. If you can get some of them to be fighting and feeding off each other, it's less maintenance for us. Yeah. And one of the nature aspects of our game is that there is a large international community, and two of the strongest components are the Finnish players. This is based in Finland, and the American players. And as they resolve ideological differences, come to understandings, it's not always pleasant. It's usually pretty painful, but it's a powerful experience.
What you see is a screenshot of the actual game. Somewhat crude, but it works. No fancy 3D graphics, no enormous sound effects and so forth, just plain text. Still, somehow, or maybe because of this, it intrigues thousands and thousands of players every day. Now, as mentioned, Batmud got started in 1990, and it got started as a school project at the Helsinki University of Technology by a student called Janne Frösén. And originally it was being run on a server called batman.hut.fi. And due to this silly name, Batman, the MUD also got its name, Batmud. Now this server also happened to be the NFS server, network file server, for the workstation in the computer labs. And eventually the owners of that lab weren't very happy about having a text-based game sitting there and eating up all the resources, so disk accesses were being timed out and so forth from like real users. So Batmud got evicted from that lab, and it merged with another MUD in another city, Tampere, and pretty much the same thing ensured. So it had to move again and again and again. And this is pretty typical for upstart MUDs. They start out fairly small, usually in school-based campuses, and before long the administrators realize that this game is starting to eat up too much resources, both computer resources as well as like man hours to run, and it has to be moved and merged with other games in order to remain successful. Now in 1992, the admins of Batmud realized that this model of constantly moving the game around to different servers around in Finland wasn't going to be a very lasting nor a good way of handling the actual MUD. So they decided to take a more formal approach to ensure the continuity of the game and to avoid having to jump between the universities. Hence, a non-profit organization called Balanced Alternative Techniques was formed to support Batmud's development and in part handle the finances required to operate a game of this size.
The social aspects of Batmud. We have over 50,000 characters from all over the world. It is a very large, active community, and the number is skewed only slightly due to the fact that in ancient times, players were allowed to have more than one character. But as you could imagine, some sleight of hand would occur where